Confederate Major General Richard Anderson, whose infantry division were supporting Jeb Stuart's cavalry, fell back to a spot midway between Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, called Tabernacle Church, and began fortifying a line there. Hooker, having convinced himself that Lee would retreat, failed to strike early while his forces were in a superior position. Abner Doubleday, a major general serving under Hooker, later described the events of that campaign.
In the present instance, it was simply suicidal for Hooker to delay action until Anderson had fortified his lines and Lee had come forward with the main body to join him. Hooker should have pressed on immediately to seize the objective, but he delayed action all that long night until 11 o'clock of the next morning. When he did make the effort, the line he was about to occupy was well fortified and held by all but one division and one brigade of Lee's army. On May 1st at 11 a.m., Hooker moved out from Chancellorsville to attack Lee in 4 columns. Sickles' corps was posted in the rear of the Chancellor House as a reserve. Stonewall Jackson, according to his invariable custom to find and fight his enemy as soon as possible, had moved forward from Tabernacle Church so that the two armies encountered each other about 2.5 miles from Chancellorsville. Altogether, the general line was a good one, for there were large open spaces where the artillery could move and maneuver, and the army were almost out of the thickets.
But Hooker, perhaps shocked by Lee's failure to retreat, ordered his troops back to Chancellorsville to take defensive positions. His subordinate officers protested. They would be surrendering the relatively high ground with its superior position for both artillery and infantry and withdrawing to the wilderness where their large numbers would be of much less importance. Despite their protests, the generals obeyed their orders and fell back to Chancellorsville, where they assumed a strong defensive position. Hooker still had about a 2-to-1 advantage over Lee in numbers, and he still expected Lee to retreat toward Richmond. But Lee had no intention of retreating. On the night of May 1st, Lee met with Jackson to plan an assault on the Union forces. While they were meeting, they received word from Jeb Stuart regarding the enemy's position.
Jackson at once asked permission to take his own corps, about 26,000 muskets, make a detour through the woods to conceal his march from observation and fall unexpectedly upon the weak point referred to by Stuart. If the 11th Corps had prepared for Jackson's approach by a line properly fortified with redoubts on the flanks, the men protected in front by felled timber and sheltered by breastworks, with the artillery at the angles crossing its fire in front, Jackson's corps would have been powerless to advance.
Just after 5 p.m., Jackson's forces attacked, screaming their rebel yell and driving all the animals of the forest before them. Jackson quickly rolled up the various brigades of Howard's corps. Some Union units made a valiant effort, but they were forced to retreat in a rout. Jackson pushed the Union right flank back 2 miles before sunset, when fresh Union troops put a halt to the advance. But Stonewall Jackson's tremendously impressive military success would be his last. That night, Jackson and a few other officers rode out ahead of the Confederate line, looking for weaknesses in the Union defenses so that the rebels could press their advantage. When they rode back to their own lines, they were mistaken for Union cavalry. Confederate infantry fired upon them in the confusion, and Jackson took 2 bullets in his left arm. The arm had to be amputated. While he lay recuperating, Stonewall Jackson contracted pneumonia. 8 days later, he died. May 3rd, the day after Jackson's successful attack, saw fierce fighting both at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. In the night, Hooker had sent word to Major General John Sedgwick that his 6th Corps should push through Fredericksburg towards Lee's rear. This meant attacking the trenches and stone wall that had thrown back Burnside's forces the previous December. This time, the result was a happier one for the Union. After being knocked back twice by Jubal Early's division defending Marie's Heights, Sedgwick's force was successful on its 3rd attempt. Back at Chancellorsville, Hooker was presented with opportunities for his units to strike at Confederate forces, but for some reason, he let those opportunities pass. Lee's forces consolidated and set up their artillery to pound Hooker's men. Hooker himself was knocked unconscious when a cannonball struck his tent. He quickly recovered and ordered a withdrawal, disappointing officers who wished to counterattack. In the face of Hooker's inactivity, Lee took a division the next day to put a stop to Sedgwick's advance. Without Sedgwick's force to distract Lee, Hooker felt his offensive could not go forward. He called council of war, asking his officers whether they felt they should withdraw. A majority of the officers preferred to stay and fight, but Hooker determined to withdraw nonetheless. Throughout the night of May 5th and in the early hours of May 6th, Hooker's forces withdrew across the river at the U.S. Ford. Their withdrawal frustrated Lee, who had planned another assault on the Union forces for the morning of the 6th. Lee had won the day, despite being outnumbered almost 2-1. But victory had come at a high cost. Of his 60,000 men involved in the campaign, over 13,000, 22%, were casualties. And in Jackson, the South lost one of its most able generals. Union losses were somewhat higher in numbers, about 17,000, but were only 13% of their forces. Given the Confederacy's limited manpower, it could ill afford those losses. It was, of course, a stunning victory for the Confederacy and a shocking loss for the Union. For years afterward, Hooker and his generals would point fingers at each other, declaring that the battle was lost because of either Hooker's timidity or his subordinates' incompetence. Almost a century and a half later, the U.S. Army Center of Military History summarized the cause of Confederate victory at Chancellorsville.
Actually, Lee's brilliant and daring maneuvers had defeated only one man, Hooker, and in no other action of the war did moral superiority of one general over the other stand out so clearly as a decisive factor in battle. Lee was so successful in part because Hooker made so many mistakes. Here again was a general who could effectively lead a body of troops under his own eyes, but could not use maps, reports, and messages to evaluate and control situations that were beyond his range of vision. Hooker, not the Army of the Potomac, lost the Battle of Chancellorsville.
The loss hurt morale in the North and boosted morale in the South. In particular, General Robert E. Lee's confidence in his army had grown so large that Virginia could not contain it. Believing his men were practically invincible, he determined to once again take the battle to the North. And so, the Army of Virginia moved from its greatest triumph to its greatest defeat. Gettysburg.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.